The other thing that I've become interested in the last few years, and Steve talked on this quite a bit as he's traveled globally, we have a number of producers in Kansas that have worked on niche marketing, okay? And I really never even understood what niche marketing was till you start studying this. And you start looking at USDA reports on all natural compounds, on organic compounds. Scott Dooley-Harry's agreeing, you know, there's a lot of literature out there on what these new products are and what the consumers want. And so when Dwayne and I wasn't playing around with fetal programming, I thought this would be a fun area to work in to help people like, you know, Kelly Wanderer, Ron Roth, Craig Good, a number of good Kansas producers that have interest in keeping their pigs performing without antibiotics. And so that's the challenge we took. 2 years ago, I started a literature review and looking at replacements, and boy, there's tons of them. I mean, I'm not going to bore you with that, but you can literally find hundreds and hundreds of different products that have been suggested in livestock feeds, whether it's poultry, beef, cattle, humans, to replace antibiotics. And so you have to pull out which ones you think are the most important. And then I started calling people out in the industry and said, this is what the literature is saying. What are you seeing? Like Aaron Gaines that spoke last year at Swine Day. I said, Aaron, you know, people like that are out in production. What's working, what's not? Let's pare these things down. And so we chose trace mineral combinations as a possibility, essential oils, and there are hundreds of essential oils when you start studying before you even get into combinations, okay? So you can just find hundreds of those. And then as well as yeast cell walls, many, many products out there that are suggested as antibiotic replacements. Okay, and I borrowed this slide right in the middle. 2 weeks ago, this past Sunday, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, comes on TV, and they're doing an interview on, it was actually an interview on GMO grains. And he starts out with the cons of GMOs, and we all know those, and then he goes, his segue into the pros of GMO grains was, you know, in the livestock industry, and luckily he didn't just say pigs, Jody, but he said in the livestock industry, they are literally pumping those animals full of antibiotics. Okay, many of you are nodding, you heard the interview, and I'm going, oh my God, this is the leader of the free world that is condemning us as pumping these animals full of antibiotics. And so I actually got upset by it and called some of my friends, they go, yeah, he actually said it. And I thought about, then I read some of the history of his viewpoints on different regulations, and every single year he's been in office, we've set a new record for the number of regulations. Every single year, there's been a new record for regulation. I don't know which way that's going to change. I have a prediction, but every single year he's been in office. And I looked at this, and I borrowed a slide from Ted Schroeder, and he actually talked about this at Cattleman's Day. He goes, because he said, Nelson, how did you even remember that talk? In 2011, he talked about the need to make sure that we continue to have technology improvements in the United States. I don't know if John's still here from Iowa, but he used Iowa corn yields as GMO grains, other technology improvements, and he compared it to Italy. And the reason he used Italy is because it's a heavily regulated nation. It's one that's very much against any, first of all, they won't even accept GMO grains, and so he compared the differences. And the comparison he made is look at the spread. You just look at the two lines, the purple line for Iowa corn yields versus Italy's yields. And again, we had a drought year in here, but just look at the lines. There's a 40 to 45 different bushel yield, and again, using agronomic terms. But my point is this: if we continue to give up and let regulations dictate the terminologies by which we raise livestock, we will no longer be a competitive nation. And Steve can get up there and show, you know, that this is what's happening. There was actually a Canadian unit, some other units. But if we continue to let the government run their operations, our competitive advantage in the United States will be lost. And so I borrowed that from Dr. Schroeder, and I give him full credit for actually extending the graph to 2015 for me. Okay, and so we've had feed-grade antibiotics since the 1950s. I'm not going to get in. Dr. Appley will do a much better job of this afternoon, and we've got the vet feed directory, so we have to have some other plans, and he's going to cover that this afternoon. But the thing that I wanted to alert you to is there's different phases in swine production where antibiotics have always worked, okay? They've always worked. And people get up and say, well, you know, we just got to totally do away with antibiotics. Well, you're going to give up some production. There's no doubt about it, and especially in the nursery phase, and most of you know that. But the key point, and the reason I use this slide is there's a consumer, in my opinion, there's a consumer movement much bigger than gestation stalls, gestation crates, and others to eliminate a lot of the antibacterials used in feeds, and so we might as well simply try to find alternatives, and there's many compounds we could look at. We actually ended up, and I'm not going to go into the details of this because this was Austin Langemeyer's experiment, and we had 9 different experiments. We not only looked at them as alone, but in combinations, trying to replace, and when I called around the industry, it was either Denocard, CTC that everybody was using, or Mecadox. And so we chose Mecadox because it appeared as though to be the highest used antibiotic. I'm sure there's a survey that says something different, but that's what the leading consultants were telling me that are actually feeding pigs every day. And we compared that then to high levels, and I'll show you the diets in a minute, of zinc and copper. Joel showed copper alone, and then in finishing pigs, he showed zinc alone. Nick Shelton was in the room earlier. In 2010, he published a paper with the nutrition group here at K-State that said use zinc in phase 1 and phase 2 diets at 3,000 parts per million, and then copper in the next phase. When we did follow-up work to that, a couple years later, the combination was numerically higher. And so we said, let's put the two together and try that. And we fed them in multiple phases. And I put up here, we only had 288 pigs, so this is not a large study, but I also put up that in the last year and a half, we rolled over a herd at Kansas State University. We went from PIC to DNA. I'm not a veterinarian. Steve didn't talk much about it being, you know, some of the health issues other than what he's seeing in production, but there's some challenges in rolling a herd over, okay? I wouldn't simply recommend that to try it overnight. There's some growing pains from an enteric disease situation. DNA sows are phenomenal in terms of production, but when you bring different genetic populations together, sometimes you get some enteric disease, which was the perfect model for us to study. We had the perfect set of pigs to look at. We fed these pigs in 3 different phases, and we fed them for a total of 42 days. I put the diets up. This is not to try to put you to sleep, but to show you they're very complex diets. By choice, when I talked to people in the industry, there was this whole discussion, does plasma, are they vegetarian diets, are they animal protein diets? And I went through the feed mill, and Austin really helped me with this. We used bovine plasma and bovine blood meal, okay? And so we covered that angle. The reason I wanted plasma in there is there's some very good immunological data with plasma that's very positive for the pig, and so I wanted that in there. The other thing we did is we acidified every one of those diets, because another really good antimicrobial controller is acidification of diets, okay? And so we put that across all the diets. We had plasma in all the diets, and that way you don't get this challenge of what about these other ingredients. We just put them in all of the formulations. In the phase 2 diets, there's still blood meal in those diets, some whey in the diets. We dropped the amount of zinc down to 2,000 parts per million from 3,000 and fed that for the duration of the experiment. Okay, it looked like the nutrition group today, the number of bar graphs, the maximum you could have was 7. Mike, you had 7, Joe had 7, so I'm only going to use 3. Okay, so I'm staying within the compliance zone, and I want to show you the data real quick. Okay, we can raise pigs without antibiotics. The control diet, negative control, no antibiotics, the lowest level of trace mineral premix, those pigs the first week, and we pelleted these diets as well. Chance that the female did a great job for us. But again, if you break it into periods and don't look at the overall nursery phase, which I'll show you in a little bit, you will see a response to antibiotics in the first couple weeks post-weaning. You'll find it repeatedly. Very few experiments where you won't find that. In this case, though, when we fed copper sulfate at 125 parts per million and zinc oxide at 3,000, we equaled, which I felt really good about, we were able to equal the antibiotic in terms of growth performance. Okay? The other thing about antibiotic-free pigs, if you measure them by periods, they're like cattle feed efficiencies. Okay? Real poor feed efficiencies, especially with enteric disease. If you look at that, control diets the first week, 4 to 1. And I remember when we used to when Gary Ali shows slides, they were actually inverted. You could get extra gain on those pigs, less than a 1-to-1 feed efficiency. You give up some in terms of performance when you go antibiotic-free. Carbadox gave a significant response, a numeric improvement to the zinc and copper combination. Looking at phase 2, again, dropping back the level of zinc oxide in these diets. Again, good performance for the control, the antibiotic-free. You can boost the performance with an antibiotic, and importantly, you can still stay under an antibiotic-free regime and get equal growth performance to the antibiotic, in this case Mecadox, by feeding zinc and copper together. And again, I think Joel mentioned that lots of times these are feed intake responses. In fact, we found a feed intake response with zinc and copper in the diet, and also an improvement versus a negative control in feed efficiency. I want to wrap up by briefly saying that when you look at the closeout on these pigs, there's some pretty phenomenal differences. And I know for a lot of systems, it's kind of disappointing to me, but growth performance is kind of going away. When I talked to some of the large production systems, they said, Jim, our goal as nutritionists is to keep the pigs alive. Okay, and we're going to feed them as cheap as we can. And I wanted to point out, there is a 5-pound difference. Skipped ahead there. There's a 5-pound difference between the zinc and copper pigs, which are still, again, antibiotic-free, versus the lower level, the trace mineral premix that K-State currently recommends. So some big opportunities if that's still important to you in your production system. Okay, so just to wrap it up then, in terms of growth rates, the antibiotic worked, and for those of you last night that were at the reception, it were very clear to me, that there is a place. I'd say it's in the nursery phase if you're going to use them. Zinc and copper did an awful good job for us. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the 5 pounds difference was statistically different, highly statistically different, and zinc and copper at high levels can be used to enhance performance in the grower-finisher phase. In the nursery phase. In terms of economics, again, the cheapest diet's the negative control. In terms of ingredient costs, these diets aren't cheap, but again, there's an $18 advantage of zinc and copper compared to Mecadox in this particular analysis. And in the phase 2 diets, it's $20 a ton. So there's not very many things today where you can enhance performance and get cheaper cost. And especially as I talk to a lot of people in the industry about some of these different additives, there's some additives that are awful expensive that's not going to get you much boost in performance. I want to wrap up. My final slide is one that when I called around the industry, one of the things I did is I learned from Steve Henry, and I didn't talk to anybody that was selling a product to the industry because I knew immediately they'd probably be a little bit biased and say you should use our product in the test. Well, my mistake was not listening to John Bergstrom, okay? We did a subsequent trial with one of his technologies, and he told me to use it in our nursery trial. This is a growing pig trial. This is very recent research that we just completed. We published in 2017, and we looked at an essential oil combined with acidification, okay? The growth performance of these pigs were absolutely no different. Now remember, we were under considerable enteric disease challenge in these pigs, okay? But if you looked at death loss of these pigs, 7% death loss on the control group and 1% on the acidification with essential oil. This is a very small study, it's preliminary, we'll do replications of this, but there are compounds out there that we can use that are not antibiotic, that'll stay within the antibiotic-free protocols, will clearly stay within antibiotic-free protocols, and help you in terms of growth rate and then also in terms of mortality. It's been several times throughout the morning that different speakers have said, thank you, okay? The two most forgotten words in our vocabulary are thank you. And to everybody that makes the food available today, that makes all the coffee, donuts, and other festivities, and makes this opportunity for a family reunion of Kansas and Midwestern people come together, we appreciate it a great deal.